Hi, I'm David Byes, your host today for True Leadership, a show about impact-driven people and initiatives at Mississippi State University. And today I'm joined by Dr. Jim Giesen. Thanks for being with me.
No problem.
So our viewers can see that in the background we've got a photograph of students sitting in physically distanced seats in the hump.
Yeah.
And this is from your class. So when you were told that you were going to be teaching in the hump, kind of what came to mind? What did you think?
Well, I first heard about it back in May. It seems like a totally different world back then.
Yeah.
And my department had emailed me and said, well, they're thinking about putting these classes in the hump. And another professor who's doing it, Whit Wade, who's in political science, he and I had actually joked before because we teach these huge classes. Mm-hmm. Normally, 400 people in a class in Old Main. And we kind of joked like, they should just put us in the stadium. They should just put us in the hump and put all the students. And then we called each other and said, well, have you been asked about this? Because, now we're going to get our wish. And I thought, well, it does solve a bunch of problems. It creates a bunch of problems. But it was May, right? So I thought, sure. I wasn't even sure whether we were going to have face-to-face classes when the semester opened up. But I said, okay. And then as, things looked like, well, this might actually happen, then I started to have to really put the class together. So my expectations, my kind of emotions about it sort of changed over the course of the summer as we got near the beginning of the semester.
Wow, I'm sure that was kind of a roller coaster in a way. So you've embraced the use of the big 4-square Jumbotron that we've got in the hump. And first day of class, I know you had a few pictures to share. Tell us what those were and why you chose them.
So I was thinking about this first day of class a lot, Here we are in this weird space, but it's not only just the weird space, it's this really weird moment of history, right? Like you have this summer, which in the middle of a pandemic, you've had all of this, all of these public demonstrations in protest of the George Floyd murder. And, I tried to put myself in the shoes of my students, right? You've had, most of them are first year students, right? So they had their springs where their proms were canceled and their graduations were canceled, mm-hmm. and their baseball and softball seasons, whatever. And so then they lived through this summer of uncertainty, and then they show up, and I wanted to tell them, I wanted to kind of show them the ways that history could help them understand their own lives. Historians always talk about that, right? We always talk about, well, you can't know your past if you don't know you can't know your present if you don't know your past. But this was a moment that just seemed to just call for it. And so I put up 4 pictures on the Jumbotron. A mugshot of John Lewis, who had just died that summer,
right.
The civil rights leader. A mugshot of him being arrested in Jackson in 1961 after the Freedom Rides. A picture of the NASCAR driver with a mask on, I Can't Breathe, the t-shirt, the first African-American popular NASCAR driver. And a picture from the 1918 flu pandemic with someone holding a sign that said, wear a mask or go to jail, which sort of was the message we were telling our students too as they filed into the hump. And then the final picture was a picture from Richmond, Virginia, of the Robert E. Lee statue there. Had been defaced by graffiti over the summer, and someone had projected an image of Harriet Tubman onto this Robert E. Lee statue, a very striking photograph. And so I wanted to kind of just connect the students to these issues we would be talking about all semester, but also to what had been going on in just the previous few months of their lives. And so the point of that lecture, that first day, I didn't really introduce my syllabus or anything. I just kind of said, if you're waiting for this moment of history, and you always think, well, these historic moments happen to other people, they happened in the past, they happened to other generations. My point was that this is it. So I put that on the big Jumbotron. I just said 3 words. This is it. Like, if you can't learn history right now in this semester, if you can't embrace this opportunity, then you're never going to find a moment like this.
So this is history.
Yeah.
We are living it, and it's maybe somewhat easy to see that in the middle of a pandemic. It's less easy to see that in day-to-day, what seems to be more rote day-to-day life.
Sure.
But that's really powerful that you were able to bring that. Let's shift gears and talk about this huge slingshot you brought into class. Tell us what it is and how do you use the slingshot to engage students in class?
So, when I first heard about the hump, I started thinking, well, your mind as a professor goes to a lot of the obstacles, right?
Right.
How am I going to connect to people? I'm not going to be able to see their faces. But then I thought, well, what are the opportunities? Usually the students file into the hump for a basketball game, and they've got cheerleaders and the flame machines. And so I started joking with people, well, I'm going to get the flame machine. And then I started thinking, well, I'm going to get a t-shirt cannon. So of course I Googled the price of a t-shirt cannon, a little out of my budget.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, what could I do if I had t-shirts? What could I do to kind of engage my students in this huge space to try and make that connection between me and all these people spread all over the hump. So I thought, well, if I got t-shirts, I could get a 3-person water balloon slingshot. So I ordered it off Amazon. I talked my department head into making 100 t-shirts that say "Making History in the Hump," right?
I love it.
And wadded them up with rubber bands. And those first couple days, as people would come in, I got a couple student volunteers, and it is a pretty big slingshot. And they would hold the sides, and I would, go back and fling these shirts. And I said, now, this isn't like a real game where you have to fight over them, because we've got to keep our social distancing. So, if it lands near you, you can get it. And they were pretty good sports about it. And now every now and then when I kind of feel like my lecture is getting a little dry, or I'm starting to lose their attention, I'll just, well, it's time for the slingshot. I'll break out the slingshot, get a couple volunteers, and we'll fling a couple into the stands. What
fun. So thanks so much for joining us today. I want to just be sure that our viewers know you've written about this. Of course, you had a tweet that went viral early on in the semester, so folks can find you on social media.
Yep.
As well on our university webpage, they can find an article you've written about this experience. So just want to say thanks to you all for joining us, and we'll be back again shortly with Dr. Laura Marler to talk more about true leadership at Mississippi State University.
Meeting the challenges of a changing world. It's a responsibility we take seriously at Mississippi State University. Today, our outstanding faculty are on the job with a passion that places them among the best in the business. We're launching new classroom models, investing in world-changing research, and providing a college experience that's second to none. Though things may look different, our sights have never been higher.
Hey, David Byes here, back with you for True Leadership, and I'm joined in this segment by Dr. Laura Marler, who is the head of Management and Information Systems in the College of Business here at Mississippi State University, as well as the director of the Family Business Education Initiative. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, David.
So, want to just talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on businesses, and particularly, small businesses. You've got expertise with that. So tell us first how challenges during the pandemic differed for businesses or employers compared to the average citizen.
Right. So individuals definitely have had a lot of challenges during this time, but I think for businesses, they bear the responsibility of taking care of their employees, providing a safe, healthy work environment. Also, they've got to consider their customers. If they have a retail environment where customers are coming in, they've got to think about that if they were going to implement social distancing. And on top of all of that, many businesses had very negative impacts on their revenues, and that resulted in cash flow problems. And when we had stay-at-home orders, certain businesses were non-essential, and those businesses were really in difficult situations where, they had a hard time figuring out how could they even operate in a way to generate revenue. So it was a very challenging time in numerous ways.
Yeah, so similar but different in terms of the organizations itself and then individuals.
Right.
Yeah, it's a catch-22. Difficult to make those decisions. So what have been some of the problems most commonly experienced by the business community, in particular during the pandemic, and which of these do you think have been most difficult to overcome?
Okay, so I think there have been a variety of challenges, but if I had to kind of, summarize them, I would say new legal requirements with the FFCRA. And that was an expansion to the Family and Medical Leave Act. And so not only are you providing leave for certain employees, you're providing paid leave with the expansion. Right. And that was leave related to, somebody who was quarantined or taking care of a child. So you had to consider that in your payroll. You had to think about how are we going to operate without this person. You also had to, think about these legal requirements and how do you translate that into policy and communicate that to your employees. And all of this happened very quickly, and there wasn't a lot of guidance at first. And so I feel like here you are, a small business, you're worried about your revenue, you're worried about your employees, you're thinking about your customers, and how do you comply with these new pieces of legislation? So there was really a lot that all companies were faced with, but I feel like small companies in particular may not have somebody wearing that HR hat.
Right.
And so it was more challenging probably for smaller businesses.
So you beat me to the punch. I wanted to ask about HR issues, and that's great. I'm glad you're thinking in that direction. I know that's your expertise and your passion and your heart, so I'm glad you covered that. What would you say the business community has learned, and particularly HR departments, HR specialists have learned as a result of COVID-19 and ways to overcome these challenges?
Well, I think anytime you have a major challenge that you're facing as a business, whether you're in HR or outside of HR, I think you have to consider what your mission is, what is your long-term strategic plan, and can you be adaptable? And ultimately, I think that's what it comes down to, whether, whether you're in HR or in another area. Now, in HR in particular, I think we saw certain HR departments were very open to things like telework, and that enabled them to have employees still working. The business was still able to remain productive. And so that was one way that they could approach the situation and still have someone employed gainfully as well.
So that leads to the next question very well, which is what have you seen regarding working remotely and those related issues? I know from an HR perspective it has to have been somewhat of a nightmare, and so what are you hearing and what are you seeing out there?
Right, so I've heard some interesting stories about telework, so things like WebEx conferencing or Zoom.
Right.
Maybe the business didn't have a protocol or a policy for that, so what's the attire? What's acceptable to have in your background? And then, we've seen interruptions, maybe you have a family member that's there, or a child, or even a pet. So I think that we've had some interesting moments on our during our telework, and I know I've met a few people's pets virtually.
Right.
So that's one challenge, but also thinking about, do employees have the technology to work from home? Do they have access to Wi-Fi that will be high speed enough to do what they need to do? Providing them with whatever equipment they might need. And then also from an HR perspective, you think about, how do we keep track of work hours to make sure we're adhering to labor requirements and making sure we're paying people for the hours they've worked? So how do we track hours worked even? So I think there were a lot of issues that maybe hadn't been thought about before because certain people had not done telework before.
Yep. Well, this has been fantastic, and I just want to be sure that our viewers know you've written a piece about this that's published on our website, so they can certainly go to the MississippiState.edu, msstate.edu website and find this. Viewers, thank you all for joining us. Please join us next time for True Leadership.